Welcome to our Week 7 video. I'm going to be talking briefly about the Romantic poets. We are turning now to the Romantic poets, and these poets represent a real shift in the kinds of Western thinking that we've encountered so far in the literature. So, for example, looking back at something like Candide, these are texts that were very interested in the ideas of the Enlightenment, and even thinking about the slave narratives that we've looked at. There's the importance of education, there's the importance of the individual, there's the importance of that individual's ability to make sense of the world around him, usually him, although we are thinking maybe about women's rights expanding at this time and questioning the logic of their oppression. But as you may remember, the Enlightenment is really about reason. It's about that kind of logical step-by-step interpretation of the world around you, and even using that to kind of call into question some of the institutions that might have tried to place restrictions on people's rights. And so the Enlightenment pursues scientific progress, and it pursues ideas of equality, both politically and also socially for individuals. The Romantic poets are interested in pushing back on that role of reason. And so if we think about this time period, it's around the turn of the century, the 18th into the 19th century. It's a time in which England is at war with France, where revolutions in places like France have occurred and then developed into these kind of tempestuous relationships with England. So these writers are navigating a time in which reason seems to have broken down. So the logic of the Enlightenment, that men should be equal, has devolved into this terrible carnage of the French Revolution. And all the promise that seemed present in that kind of Enlightenment investment in reason has seemed to have broken down. So what do the Romantic poets turn to? Well, what is the opposite of reason? Your Norton notes a lot of different things that might stand in for it, but the Romantic poets turned away from logic and reason and started to think about the supernatural, or the power of folk tales and tales about witches or ghosts or ancient mariners as a way of explaining the world around them, or tapping into some kind of unearthly supernatural power. They also turned to the power of nature. Right, since logic and man had perhaps failed, what is there anymore? Well, maybe there's actually just this incomprehensibility about the world around us, and nature was a way to represent that incomprehensibility. You can look at a math equation and perhaps understand it, but you can look at a mountain and be completely staggered by its beauty and also by its danger that is deigning at this moment not to destroy you. And so in the Romantic poets' work, you may notice a lot of natural imagery. As the Norton points out, up until this point, a lot of natural imagery in poems was very stereotypical and structured. So you had images of farm life, or you had pastorals where you had shepherds and shepherdesses, and you didn't have to really think about any of the mechanics of farming or what it's like to actually make a living from the land. And the Romantic poets were interested in then thinking about something much beyond the agrarian, something much wilder. So you see their poetry is actually also reflecting developments in the English garden at this time, which moved from this very structured neoclassical kind of beautiful, symmetrical, with gravel walks garden to these sweeping trails through very wild woods where you would have benches to sit and look out on these vistas. And the idea that is that it should be this kind of inscrutable kind of garden was represented by the fact that some of these gardens even had little hermit cottages in them, where there would be a resident hermit, kind of adding to this idea of the picturesqueness of the landscape, but also the strangeness and wildness of it. With this idea of strangeness and wildness also came the idea of the sublime, which is that same kind of mix of emotions I was talking about before with reference to the mountain, that nature is both beautiful and terrible, and that in contemplating it, we are also contemplating our smallness in the universe, and the unknowability of the world around us, as represented by these kind of fantastic visions, which these vistas are so impressive, both because they awe us with their majesty, but then also can terrify us with how small we seem in comparison and how powerful they are. So you see treatments of nature that are very different in Romantic poetry. The other main shift that you see is in poetry up until this point, there was usually not as much investment in the lyric form. So a lot of what we're looking at this week are actually lyrics. Wordsworth and Coleridge, when they published their kind of groundbreaking volume that they worked on together, they wrote in the lyric form. And this kind of self-centered form where the I of the poem is actually very close to the I of the poet is unusual at this point. Now, I think we're very used to reading poems and understanding that the I is a construction, but many times it offers a window into the poet's psychology. Before this point, the I was often associated with this kind of overarching general idea of a poet, kind of that it would be someone channeling the voice of the muse rather than their own personal interiority. And so with the Romantic poets, they became more interested in examining the self, what their own interpretation of the world around them was like. So the poems became more personal, more intimate. They spent more time linking their views of the landscape around them and maybe even the supernatural occurrences around them that happened in folk tales from the area to their own personal lives and how then they interpreted those vistas. And so you'll see an emphasis in the poems that we're reading on I and on that I representing the I of the poet, observing the world around, at least in the case of the writers for this week, him. So we're reading Wordsworth and Coleridge, who represent kind of the very first generation of these Romantic poets. Their Romantic lyrics were seen as this groundbreaking work that really marked this shift in poetry to the more personal, to the more introspective and psychological, and then also to the more natural, both in terms of being interested in nature and then also kind of being more interested in mimicking human speech and human diction rather than this kind of constructed poetic voice that might be carried out in heroic couplets. And then Shelley and Keats represent the next generation of Romantic poets that come after Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth and Coleridge were seen as very successful, but ultimately they were very interested in revolution when they were younger and were seen as becoming more conservative as they got older, especially Wordsworth, who was seen as kind of selling out. Coleridge, unfortunately, kind of just diffused into the ether because of his opium addiction. I don't know if you can hear the noises outside behind me, but that's my children playing. I'm sure they are very interested in nature, just as the Romantic poets are. But in terms of Shelley and Keats, they are disappointed in the kind of later conservatism of the first generation of Romantic poets, and they kind of take up the mantle of their early revolutionary spirit and think about carrying that into the future. So they tend to see Wordsworth and Coleridge as kind of the old guard and them as the new developing Romantic poets. So I hope you enjoy the poems this week. I have some questions about them for you in the discussion boards, especially about Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I feel like is a very trippy poem that often gives students a lot of pleasure, but also a lot of confusion. So I hope that we can muddle through that together, and then I hope that you also enjoy the other kind of rustic poems by Wordsworth and some of the other things that I've had you read for this week. And with that, I hope that you have a great week.